September 26, 1944. Winston Churchill had just returned to London from the Second Quebec Conference with Roosevelt. He was exhausted from the transatlantic journey. In his study at 10 Downing Street, he read a telegram from Field Marshal Alan Brooke. The message was brief and devastating. Operation Market Garden had failed. British 1st Airborne Division destroyed at Arnhem. Over 8,000 casualties. The bridge too far hadn't been captured. Churchill set down the telegram and poured himself a whiskey. He knew what came next. The American press would blame Montgomery. Eisenhower would want explanations. And Churchill would have to defend the British general who had just produced 17,000 Allied casualties on a plan that never had a chance of succeeding. The problem wasn't whether Montgomery deserved to be fired. The problem was that Churchill couldn't afford to fire him. Montgomery was Britain's only military celebrity, the hero of El Alamein, the general who had finally given Britain a victory after years of humiliating defeats. If Churchill fired Montgomery, he would have to admit that Britain's greatest general had led a catastrophic failure. He would have to tell the British people that their hero was incompetent. He would have to explain why British forces kept making mistakes while American armies advanced across France. Churchill couldn't do any of that. Not with a general election coming, not with the Labour Party gaining strength, not with Britain's position in the world already weakening. So he made a decision that would cost thousands of American lives over the next 6 months. He would defend Montgomery no matter what. To understand why Churchill couldn't fire Montgomery, you have to understand what El Alamein meant to Britain in 1942. Britain had been at war for 3 years. They had lost Norway, France, Greece, Crete, Singapore, Tobruk. Every major battle against Germany had ended in defeat or evacuation. The British public was exhausted, demoralized, and questioning whether Britain could actually win the war. Then Montgomery took command of the 8th Army in North Africa. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery attacked Rommel's forces at El Alamein in Egypt. After nearly 2 weeks of brutal fighting, the Germans retreated. It was Britain's first clear victory against German forces in 3 years of war. Churchill ordered church bells rung across Britain for the first time since 1939. At the Lord Mayor's luncheon on November 10th, he declared that this was not the end, not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. Montgomery became an instant national hero. The British press portrayed Montgomery as the general who had finally figured out how to beat the Germans. His trademark beret with 2 badges became iconic. His careful, methodical approach was praised as British professionalism defeating German aggression. Montgomery understood the power of his celebrity. He cultivated relationships with journalists. He gave quotable interviews. He made sure photographers captured him visiting troops and planning operations. By 1943, Montgomery wasn't just a general. He was a symbol of British resilience and military competence. Churchill recognized this immediately. Montgomery gave Britain something it desperately needed after years of defeat: national pride. Churchill was a politician before he was a war leader. He understood that wars are won by coalitions that maintain public support. Montgomery was essential to maintaining that support. The Conservative Party had governed Britain since 1931, but by 1944, polls showed the Labour Party gaining strength. The British public was tired, rationed, bombed out of their homes. They wanted social reform and economic security after the war. Churchill knew his government was vulnerable. One of his few political strengths was military leadership. The British people trusted Churchill to win the war. Montgomery was proof that British generals could defeat the Germans. If Churchill fired Montgomery, he would hand the Labour Party a devastating political weapon. They could argue that Churchill sacrificed Britain's best general to please the Americans. that he valued the alliance more than British military prestige. Churchill had another concern. Britain's position as a great power was slipping. The United States and Soviet Union were the real military superpowers now. Britain was contributing less than 25% of Allied forces in Western Europe. Montgomery's celebrity helped maintain the illusion of British military equality with America. British newspapers portrayed the war as a partnership between equals. Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group. Eisenhower commanded overall, Britain and America together. If Churchill admitted Montgomery was incompetent, he would have to admit British military power was declining, that American generals made better decisions, that Britain needed American help to win. These were truths Churchill refused to acknowledge publicly, so Montgomery became politically untouchable. By September 1944, Montgomery was obsessed with proving British forces could win the decisive victory of the war. Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. The Germans were in full retreat. The end seemed close. Montgomery proposed Operation Market Garden. The plan was to drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines in Holland, capture bridges across the Rhine, and open a corridor for British armored forces to drive into Germany. Montgomery promised it would end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower had doubts. Intelligence reports indicated stronger German resistance in the area than Montgomery acknowledged. The plan required everything to go perfectly. One bridge not captured meant complete failure. But Montgomery pressured Eisenhower relentlessly. Eisenhower also faced pressure from Washington. The 1st Allied Airborne Army was sitting idle in England. If the war ended before they were used, there would be questions about why such expensive forces accomplished nothing. Eisenhower approved the operation. He diverted supplies from American armies to support Montgomery. 3 American airborne divisions were placed under British command. The entire Allied Air Force was dedicated to Market Garden. What made this especially costly was Montgomery's failure to prioritize clearing the Scheldt estuary to open the port of Antwerp. Without that port, no amount of supplies could sustain major operations for long. Montgomery promised this would vindicate his strategic vision. He would prove that concentrated British-led operations could end the war faster than methodical American advances. He was gambling Britain's military reputation on a plan that required perfect execution. The gamble failed spectacularly. Operation Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. Within hours, it was clear something was wrong. The 1st Airborne Division dropped too far from the Arnhem Bridge. German resistance was much stronger than expected. Communication systems failed. British paratroopers fought desperately at Arnhem. They held the north end of the bridge for 3 days against overwhelming German force. Ammunition ran out. Medical supplies were exhausted. German tanks surrounded their positions. The ground forces advancing up the single highway couldn't reach them in time. The road was too narrow. German resistance too strong. The entire operation depended on speed, and speed was impossible. By September 25th, the situation at Arnhem was hopeless. British commanders ordered evacuation. Of the 10,000 British paratroopers who dropped at Arnhem, only 2,400 made it back across the Rhine. The rest fell in battle or were captured. Total Allied casualties exceeded 17,000 men. Market Garden had failed completely. No Rhine crossing, no corridor into Germany, no war ending by Christmas. The supplies that could have supported Patton's advance had been wasted on Montgomery's failed operation. German commanders were shocked by the operation's boldness and confused by its poor execution. They couldn't understand why British forces had been dropped so far from their objectives. Why the ground advance relied on a single highway. Why intelligence had been so wrong about German strength. German commanders later admitted that Market Garden was a brilliant concept, ruined by inadequate planning and execution. The failure revealed that Montgomery's careful, methodical reputation was undeserved. He had taken a desperate gamble and lost. Montgomery's response to the Market Garden disaster revealed everything about his character. He refused to accept responsibility. He blamed everyone except himself. Montgomery blamed the weather for delaying air support. He blamed intelligence offices for not predicting German strength accurately. He blamed American generals for not sending enough supplies. He even blamed the Dutch resistance for providing inadequate information. What Montgomery didn't do was acknowledge that his plan had been fundamentally flawed, that dropping paratroopers miles from their objectives made no sense, that relying on a single highway for the ground advance was catastrophically reckless, that his promise of ending the war by Christmas had been fantasy. Within days of the failure, Montgomery was planning his next operation. He wanted priority for supplies to cross the Rhine through a different route. He wanted American divisions transferred to his command. He wanted Eisenhower to abandon the broad front strategy. Montgomery told his staff that Market Garden had been 90% successful, that they had captured most of the bridges, that it was a gallant attempt defeated by bad luck rather than bad planning. He genuinely seemed to believe this. Churchill's private reaction to Market Garden was intense frustration. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded in his diary that Churchill was furious about the results when he learned the full scope of the disaster. Churchill had staked British military prestige on Montgomery's plan. He had personally lobbied Eisenhower to approve it. He had argued to Roosevelt that British forces deserved the chance to deliver the decisive blow. Now 8,000 British paratroopers were lost or captured for nothing. Churchill's heated exchanges with Montgomery regarding the failure occurred largely through Alan Brooke as intermediary. Brooke conveyed Churchill's demands for explanations. Why had intelligence been so wrong? Why had the plan relied on capturing so many bridges perfectly? Why had Montgomery promised success when the operation was so risky? Montgomery's answers, relayed back through Brooke, did not satisfy Churchill. Montgomery claimed the operation had achieved most objectives, that bad weather had prevented success, that with slightly better luck, Market Garden would have worked. Churchill recognized this as deflection and excuse-making. Churchill told Brooke privately that Montgomery had become dangerously arrogant, that his celebrity had gone to his head, that he was making promises he couldn't keep and blaming others when he failed. Brooke agreed but warned Churchill against any drastic action. Firing Montgomery now would be political ruin. The British public didn't know how badly Market Garden had failed. The press was still portraying it as a gallant near success. Churchill couldn't afford the political consequences, so he made a decision that would define the rest of the war in Europe. On October 8, 1944, Churchill addressed the House of Commons about Market Garden. His speech was a masterpiece of political deflection. He praised the courage of British paratroopers. He emphasized the bridges that had been captured. He mentioned the German casualties inflicted. What Churchill didn't mention was the strategic failure. He didn't acknowledge that the operation had achieved none of its objectives. He didn't explain that 8,000 British troops had been sacrificed for no military gain. He certainly didn't criticize Montgomery. Instead, Churchill framed Market Garden as a bold attempt that came close to success. He said the operation had been gallant and well conceived. He praised Montgomery's leadership and determination. He made it sound like British forces had nearly accomplished something remarkable. The British press followed Churchill's lead. Newspapers reported Market Garden as a near victory. The Daily Telegraph called it a brilliant operation that fell just short. The Times praised Montgomery's daring. The emphasis was on British courage, not British failure. American newspapers saw it differently. The New York Times reported that Market Garden had been a costly failure, with nothing to show for 17,000 casualties. The Washington Post questioned Montgomery's judgment. Time magazine suggested that British commanders were overly cautious and then reckless when trying to prove otherwise. Churchill noticed the different coverage. He recognized that American public opinion was turning against Montgomery, but British public opinion still supported their national hero. That's what mattered for Churchill's political survival. He had successfully protected Montgomery's reputation while sacrificing American trust. It was a calculation Churchill would repeat over the next 4 months. British politics mattered more than American friendship. The resources wasted on Market Garden had consequences that wouldn't become clear for months. The fuel, ammunition, and supplies diverted to Montgomery's operation could have supported Patton's Third Army. Patton had been racing toward the German border in September 1944. Patton's forces had liberated most of France in 3 weeks. They were within striking distance of the Rhine River. Patton believed he could cross into Germany before winter, but Allied supply lines still ran all the way back to the Normandy beaches. There wasn't enough fuel for everyone. Eisenhower chose to give Montgomery priority for the limited supplies available. Patton's advance was halted. Even without Market Garden, the broad front strategy would have slowed operations. But giving Montgomery priority for an operation that failed completely meant those scarce resources accomplished nothing. The delay gave Germany time to regroup. By December 1944, German forces had rebuilt their defenses along the Siegfried Line. They had moved reserves into position. They had prepared the counteroffensive that would become the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive. Over 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. American soldiers froze to death in foxholes. Entire units were overrun. The Battle of the Bulge happened because Allied forces had paused in September. They had paused because resources went to Market Garden instead of to Patton's advance. Market Garden failed because Montgomery's plan was flawed. Thousands of American soldiers died in December because Montgomery had wasted Allied resources in September, and Churchill had defended Montgomery instead of holding him accountable. The Battle of the Bulge created another crisis that forced Churchill to defend Montgomery. During the German offensive, Eisenhower temporarily placed American forces north of the Bulge under Montgomery's command. This was for operational coordination. Montgomery took this temporary arrangement as validation of his importance. When the German offensive was defeated, Montgomery held a press conference on January 7, 1945. He told reporters that he had taken command of a confused situation and organized the defense that stopped the Germans. Montgomery made it sound like American generals had panicked, like American forces had been on the verge of collapse, like only British leadership had saved the day. The reality was that American soldiers had done the fighting and dying while Montgomery coordinated from headquarters. American generals were enraged. Bradley delivered an ultimatum to Eisenhower. After what Montgomery said, if you leave him in command, you'll have to look for a new 12th Army Group commander. Patton backed Bradley completely. Eisenhower drafted an order to fire Montgomery and send him home in disgrace. The order sat on Eisenhower's desk, waiting for signature. Churchill learned about the crisis immediately. He knew that if Eisenhower fired Montgomery, the political fallout would be catastrophic for Churchill personally. The British public would be outraged. Parliament would demand explanations. The Labour Party would attack Churchill for allowing Britain's greatest general to be humiliated. Churchill went into emergency action. He called Eisenhower and begged him not to fire Montgomery. He promised Montgomery would apologize. He gave a speech in Parliament praising American soldiers and their sacrifice during the Bulge. He did everything possible to save Montgomery's career. Once again, Churchill had to choose between Montgomery's mistakes and British political necessity. Once again, he chose to protect Montgomery. And once again, it cost him American trust and respect. Montgomery had no idea how close he was to being fired until his chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Gingand, saw Eisenhower's draft relief order. De Gingand flew to Montgomery's headquarters and told him the truth. Eisenhower was about to fire him. Churchill might not be able to stop it this time. Montgomery was stunned. De Gingand had already written an apology. He begged Montgomery to sign it. After resistance, Montgomery agreed. The apology was carefully worded to admit nothing. Montgomery expressed regret that his remarks had been misunderstood. He praised American courage. He pledged cooperation with Eisenhower. What Montgomery didn't do was retract his claims about saving the Americans. He didn't admit the press conference had been inappropriate. He didn't acknowledge that American forces had won the Battle of the Bulge without needing British rescue. The apology was empty. American commanders knew it. British officials knew it. Even Churchill knew it. But it was enough to prevent Montgomery from being fired. Churchill had successfully intervened to save his career. The price was permanent damage to Allied command relationships. American generals now actively despised Montgomery. They refused to serve under him. They questioned every plan he proposed. The easy cooperation of earlier years was gone. Montgomery himself learned nothing from the crisis. He went to his grave believing his press conference had been honest and that American reaction had been oversensitive. He never understood that claiming credit for other people's victories destroys trust permanently. Churchill understood all of this. He knew Montgomery was damaging the alliance. He knew American commanders wanted Montgomery gone. He knew Montgomery's arrogance and incompetence were costing lives and prolonging the war. But Churchill also knew he couldn't fire Montgomery without destroying his own political position. So he accepted the damage to Anglo-American relations as the price of domestic political survival. It was cynical, calculated, and probably necessary. British politics trumped Allied unity. By early 1945, Churchill faced a deeper fear than political embarrassment. Britain had cannibalized its last manpower reserves. The nation was exhausted. If their only military hero was revealed as a failure, Churchill feared the British public would lose the will to finish the march to Berlin. Some might even demand a negotiated peace. Churchill also worried about Britain's post-war position. The war had bankrupted Britain. The empire was unsustainable. British military power was declining relative to America and the Soviet Union. Montgomery was one of the few remaining symbols of British greatness. Sacrificing Montgomery to please Eisenhower would symbolize Britain's subordinate status. So Churchill kept defending Montgomery. He defended him after Market Garden, after the press conference, after every controversy and failure. He defended Montgomery even when he privately believed Montgomery deserved criticism. The defense became automatic, and in the end, it was for nothing. In July 1945, immediately after Germany's defeat, British voters rejected Churchill in a landslide. Labour won 393 seats to the Conservatives' 197. Clement Attlee became Prime Minister. The British people had appreciated Churchill's war leadership. They just didn't want him running the country in peacetime. Churchill's protection of Montgomery hadn't saved his political career. It had only damaged the Anglo-American alliance for nothing. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. Montgomery accepted the surrender of German forces in his sector and posed for photographs. British newspapers celebrated him as one of the architects of victory. Churchill praised his leadership in Parliament. American commanders watched this victory celebration with bitter resentment. They knew what Montgomery's failures had cost: the Arnhem disaster, the months of delay that enabled the Battle of the Bulge, the constant drain of resources to operations that achieved nothing. Eisenhower's private assessment of Montgomery was devastating. "He's a canalized type of strategist," Eisenhower wrote. "He can't seem to understand the broad picture." It was a diplomatic way of saying Montgomery had tunnel vision and couldn't think beyond his own sector. Bradley was more blunt. He told reporters after the war that Montgomery was the most overrated general in Europe, that his reputation was built on one victory at El Alamein and years of publicity, that American soldiers had won the war while Montgomery took credit. Patton's assessment was the harshest. He wrote that Montgomery's incompetence had cost thousands of American lives, that Churchill's political protection of Montgomery had been a betrayal of the alliance, that the British had put domestic politics ahead of military victory. The numbers supported these harsh judgments: the staggering bill of Arnhem with no strategic gain, the frozen nightmare of the Ardennes enabled by the September delay, the extended campaign in Holland fighting through territory that could have been bypassed. Churchill's defense of Montgomery had real costs measured in American blood. Coalition warfare forces leaders to make calculations that pure military logic would never justify. When the political cost of the right decision becomes unbearable, leaders choose politics. Every time. Those calculations get justified later as strategic wisdom or alliance maintenance. The memoirs get written, the reputations get protected, the decisions get defended for decades. But the soldiers who paid the price for those calculations don't write memoirs. They're already in the ground.